All right. Hello. Chapter 8, Regulation and Antitrust Legislation. So this chapter just kind of talks about kind of misunderstanding, or at least giving the realities of when a lot of times we'll complain about, oh, there's too much regulation and it's harming the free market. Or we're people who are more on that side say we got to watch out for monopolies. We got to look out for situations where these companies that in the free market become too powerful, and there isn't a free market and prices are not being set the right way. So that's when the government needs to step in and do something about it. And so I just think his arguments in here are pretty interesting, not for absolutely no regulation or antitrust legislation, but understanding what actually happens. Again, not the intention when we step in, but oftentimes the unintended realities and incentives that are created when we interfere with the free market. And so, first question: what is the theoretical purpose of regulatory commissions and antitrust laws? And so there's two things there: regulatory commissions and antitrust laws. Generally speaking, the regulation is the idea that you set up a commission to regulate prices in an industry where it's non-competitive. And so you have an industry where there isn't a really competitive market, and there's a fear that there's a monopoly where they're going to be able to control the prices and, again, manipulate consumers. And so we need a regulatory commission to come in and set the prices. He gives the example of the railroads in the 19th century, and the phone companies in the early 20th century, uh, because there just weren't a lot of competitors. And then there's a fear, well, if there's only one or two firms in this industry and they're going to be able to manipulate prices, we need to step in with regulation, a regulatory commission to make sure they're charging only what's appropriate. And again, kind of makes sense. The antitrust laws is the idea that if you have a company that's growing too big and it's getting involved in many different industries or facets of its own market, and it has too large of a share of the marketplace for whatever it's selling in. Again, famous example of, say, maybe Standard Oil in the 19th century, or U.S. Steel or something like that, a really powerful growing company. We need to implement these antitrust laws and limit that company's growth and expansion so that it cannot dominate a certain industry and therefore, again, manipulate prices and not have enough competition, and therefore people are being cheated by these corporations that have too much power over prices in their own marketplace. And so that's what these two things are. One, and basically the same thing. But again, one is to actually, regulatory commissions actually look to set the prices and say, look, we're going to make sure what's fair because the market's not operating correctly. And so we're going to set the prices. Antitrust is more of like kind of a set of surveillance or restrictions saying, okay, we're only going to let you grow or expand or get this involved to a certain point, because if you were to get any bigger or more involved, then you'd be threatening to dominate the market. And so we want to look at, well, what that's the intention. And again, sounds right. We're kind of, again, watch out for those Bond villain companies that just can completely ruin our lives. But let's look at, he talks about what actually tends to happen, or why do these things, the actual results of these tend to be more negative for the marketplace and for the economy than positive. Number two, so what nearly impossible job, starting with the first one, do regulatory commissions have? Why is this so difficult? What example does the text give? Their job is to set prices. Their job is to set, well, what's the fair price? And we've already said that is a tricky question because that depends on demand, that depends on the cost of production and supply. Typically, you'd have a free market setting a price. And so in these situations where we don't seem to have a competitive market, the commission comes in to set the prices, but what he says, that's nearly impossible. He says that's impossible because, one, there is no market to set the price. So how do we know? So any number that a commission comes up with is kind of arbitrary. Well, they're kind of pulling it out of the sky saying, well, I guess given the circumstances and what this seems to cost and what we just kind of think is fair, which is a word that is pretty much meaningless, we're going to set prices. So that's really difficult. He gives the example of electricity, and how really the cost of electricity varies from region to region, time of day, season of the year. And so to kind of come up with, well, what's the fair price of electricity, is really difficult because it's always changing and it's very variable given all sorts of circumstances and geographic locations. Um, um, Et cetera, et cetera. And so he says, for a commission to come in and set a fair price, you can't really trust that price to have any long-standing grounding in reality, because of all the different variables it's trying to take into account. The other problem that setting prices so difficult is because that prices change. Again, that we've talked about how much economies and circumstances change due to social, technological, and economic changes. So how can a commission keep up with that and say, well, now given this new technology or now given these new circumstances, here's what the price should be, or now that this innovation is taking place, now we can charge this. It's very hard for a commission to keep up with that. And so the prices set by these commissions oftentimes don't reflect changing circumstances. And again, he talks about the electricity industry and how the prices were based upon equipment that is steadily growing older and older and older. And because there's no updating of that equipment, they don't know what the price could be if they had updated their equipment and they had innovated a little bit more. Or they doesn't take into account, well, what if they switch to different forms of electricity? Like there's a big difference between the cost of coal versus wind versus solar versus nuclear power as the source of that electricity. And so where the market would set that price by different firms trying to create profits and losses, when a regulatory commission sets those prices from the outside, you can't really trust that that's a true value or an efficient value price for that particular commodity. And finally, another reason this is difficult is he talks about that there oftentimes these commissions are basically political. And so that they're not making their decisions not based on solely on the marketplace, but based upon what the consumers want and how they're communicating that to the politicians. So many times these prices, they could shift in various directions based upon what makes sense in reality, given the cost and the efficiencies of producing the good. But politicians are going to impose a price. And again, you kind of like think of rent control as an example of this. That's an example of a regulatory commission to some extent. You have these housing boards in a lot of, I think, major cities around the country. They're going to set a price based on what feels good to the people, what's going to get them votes, what's going to kind of limit outrage, or what's going to drop so low that it's going to make people happy. And again, the price is imposed from the outside for political reasons with no real bearing on what's going on the ground in the actual economics of the situation. And so it's a very difficult job to begin with, and one that sets us up for prices that really can't be trusted. So number three, kind of digging into the consequences of that, how do regulatory commissions end up doing the opposite of what they were intended to do over time? Again, a chief idea of this class is, yes, we have intentions, but those are not the same as outcomes. What are the actual outcomes, the incentives created when we make economic decisions? And he argues in this chapter that what regulatory commissions do is they go from protecting the people from potential price manipulation by companies that are monopolies because they don't have a lot of competition in their particular markets. And they actually tend to shift over time to becoming a protection for those existing monopolistic companies. And he says basically because they're set to guard against monopoly, but over time they actually tend to create monopolies. And so wherever you see a regulatory commission set up, because there's few firms, what would naturally happen over time without that commission is prices would fluctuate based upon the various changes in the marketplace. You would begin to get new competitors over time coming in and competing with large firms. He says one of our big misunderstandings is we think just because a company's big and powerful and the only one at some point, we think that's going to be true forever. When over time, competition will emerge and they will force that larger company to change. But when we set up these regulatory commissions, they tend to create boundaries and barriers for a particular industry, so that one, the existing company doesn't have the motivation to change and innovate because, well, they're already being regulated. So they're just going to exist and do whatever the commission tells them. And you're not going to get any new fresh blood into the industry to compete and force those existing companies to drive down their prices and to be more efficient and to get with the times. And so what kind of you could think about it is these commissions basically kind of ossify, they calcify, they harden, petrify, keep using my synonyms. They lock a marketplace into whatever circumstance, look at the circumstance, say, this isn't good, let's regulate it. Once you do that, you freeze it. And now it's not going to change. It's not going to be dynamic. The existing company is going to grow fat and lazy and inefficient. And the ones that would come in and kind of inject fresh blood and do all the great things that competition does to drive down prices and create innovation and better meet the needs of the people, that never happens in those regulated industries. And so again, they're meant to protect people from a monopoly, but they actually pretty much guarantee the continued existence of a monopoly, and we never get a chance to see what might have been. We think, oh, well, it's pretty good. I'm glad the price of this is seemingly stable, or it only goes up by so much over time. But we never know what could have been invented, what could have been innovated, what price, how efficient it could have become if it hadn't been so heavily regulated and set by, again, an outside commission. The other point he makes is because these commissions, they never recede, they only increase their powers. So once you set up a regulatory commission, again, say the marketplace did change, they were trying to prevent a monopoly. Over time, there's more firms that want to get in, it's going to become competitive. They don't need to, they can let the market kind of regulate itself. And they can say, oh, okay, we don't need to exist anymore, goodbye. Let's eliminate this commission. Very rarely, nothing, famously said, nothing is more permanent than a temporary government commission. And so he says that they don't want to lose their power. No commission wants to say, you know what, we have no reason to exist anymore. Please take away my job. I'll go do something else. When in the reality of the market might be, he gives the example of the train regulation. There might have been some argument to regulate the railroad industries when there were so few of them, and they could potentially be harming people with their prices. But with the increase of train companies, or then he said with the motor vehicles and roads, the marketplace would completely create major competition, and there would be no monopolies. But there's really no reason to regulate that anymore. But a commission's not going to say, okay, never mind, you don't need us anymore. They're going to say, no, let us regulate trucks too. Let us regulate cars too. When again, the whole point was to prevent a monopoly. There's not a monopoly. It shouldn't exist anymore. But it's very hard for people to say, you know what, my job serves no purpose. We'll let nature take its course without me. I'll go do something else. That's not the nature of political regulation. And so government grows. And so once we put it in place, not only does it freeze the market and prevent it from being dynamic and changing and efficient, it also expands bigger and bigger and bigger and seeks to take more and more under its purview. And then that's just going to freeze more and more of the marketplace and make it more and more efficient overall. A lot of this we could apply to question number 4. What is the positive benefit of antitrust laws, yet how do they often create cushioned capitalism and work against the very purpose they were created? He says one positive benefit of an antitrust law, which is limiting the growth and of a particular company to dominate, or a set of companies, a cartel of companies, to dominate a certain industries. He says they can prevent price collusion. They can prevent these companies from saying, hey, you know what, let's fix the price. You only charge this much and we'll only charge that much. And so nobody will undercut the other one. And so again, the free market isn't operating. So you want to institute these antitrust laws to prevent the one company or one group of companies from arbitrarily setting high prices. And he says that is potentially a good, but he says the negative benefit of these might even outweigh even that one good, because what he says is when you limit the growth of a corporation within a certain industry, you're telling it can't grow. What that oftentimes turned into is limited competition. That when you're saying in this industry we're only going to allow so much growth, then now it's harder for that company itself to grow and possibly bring economies of scale to play and drive down prices. It can't get involved, and you can't necessarily get new competitors into that market in order to help drive down prices. And so basically the antitrust laws over time tend to limit competition. And this creates what he calls cushioned capitalism, where you have businesses and they're still operating by profits and losses, but they're kind of like living in like an animal on a nature preserve, and you're not letting in the predators in to actually deal with to actually force the animals to adapt and stay healthy. They're cushioned. They feel like they're living a real life. They feel like they're really competing in a marketplace, but that marketplace is not the real marketplace. It's being cushioned by antitrust laws. And so that means that those companies, if they're cushioned, are not operating at optimal efficiency. They don't have to face competition. They don't have, again, like an animal, doesn't have to train. It doesn't have to stay fit. It doesn't have to pay attention. It doesn't have to respond. It's safe. It's cushioned by, again, the regulation, the trust law came in to make sure it didn't grow so much, but then that also meant that regulation kind of protected that firm in its existence, and it prevented it from facing the realities of an open and savage but also efficient competitive free market. And so he says that the issue with antitrust laws is it creates this non-competitive spheres in which companies grow very inefficient because they're not facing the true competition they would face if every firm was allowed to compete and expand. And sometimes that means a big company getting even bigger. But again, a big company getting bigger, like a Walmart, could potentially drive down prices because it's bringing in economies of scale and it's doing things to improve the marketplace. Even when something you hear about these giant, Standard Oil in the 19th century becoming so powerful, what Standard Oil did by growing big was actually bring a lot of different industries under its purview and make those industries more efficient, and it dropped down the price of oil for everybody because it was allowed to expand and because it was allowed to be involved in various facets of the delivery and the production of oil across the country. And so just because a company grows big and just because a company dominates a certain industry doesn't mean it's creating inefficient prices. That might actually allow it to lower prices, and it might allow the other thing to keep in mind, he says, is just because it's big, even if a company has 90% of an industry's competitive market, that 10%, if you allow that 10% to compete, it will force the big 90%er to adapt and change. But again, like in both these cases, it's the same theme. When the regulation or the antitrust law is set up, it kills the realities of all the benefits of a free market, and it tends to establish and ossify and freeze the market. And that's to the benefit of whoever it's regulated. Sometimes you'll hear companies, they want to be regulated. There's a big argument about, should the government regulate big tech right now? And in some extent, big tech wants to be regulated because if they're regulated, then basically the government is saying, you for sure get to exist. You get to exist. We're going to feed you now. You don't have to survive in the survival of the fittest free market anymore. You get to exist. Yes, we're going to limit what you can do. Yes, we're going to control you, but you're now our cash. You're now a cow at the dairy, hooked up. You're guaranteed a job for life. You're guaranteed your existence for life. We're going to make sure you survive, and we're going to limit anybody else who can enter this marketplace. And so again, you just create this frozen market that is not dynamic, that is not meeting people's needs. It's not driving down costs. It's not doing any of the things that a free market is supposed to do. Again, what we intend to do sounds right, but the reality ends up being the very opposite of what's intended.